A ruthless teen killer, Patrick McVeigh seemed completely untouchable, masking his greed behind a charming facade that fooled nearly everyone in his orbit. He openly taunts the victim's family in court, confident his deceptions would hold, while investigators race to uncover a history of devastating financial fraud. But the entire case would hinge on the one person he never expected to betray him when his own sister exposes his single darkest lie. The last thing Ella Martinez ever saw was the face of her business partner, a face she had trusted completely, twisted into a mask of cold financial calculation. In the tough blue-collar neighborhoods of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, loyalty was a currency more valuable than cash. But for 17-year-old Patrick McVeigh, it was merely a resource to be liquidated. The city, with its historic bones and a famously short fuse, had seen its share of violence. But the murder of Ella Martinez felt different, a betrayal that left a uniquely bitter taste. It was a crime not of passion but of profit, an entry on a ledger written in blood. Ella had been the heart of their small tech startup, a brilliant coder with an infectious optimism that had convinced investors to take a chance on two teenagers with a dream. She poured her life savings, a modest inheritance from her grandparents, into the company, believing in Patrick's talent for marketing and his seemingly endless charisma. That charisma, however, was a meticulously crafted illusion, a tool he used to build a labyrinth of lies and false promises. In a city built on a blue-collar work ethic, Patrick was a con artist in the making, and Ella was his masterpiece of deception. The discovery was made on a Tuesday morning, the air thick with the damp chill of the Schuylkill River. Ella's father, after 2 days of unanswered calls, had used his spare key to enter her small row house in the Fishtown neighborhood, a place where the old city met the new. The scene inside was one of sterile, calculated violence. There was no sign of a struggle, only the quiet, brutal finality of a life extinguished for convenience. The Philadelphia police, accustomed to chaos, were struck by the orderliness of it all, the chilling indication that this was not a random act, but an execution. Patrick was the one who called the police, his voice a perfect performance of panicked grief, a detail that would later be scrutinized with nauseating clarity. He told them he had been trying to reach Ella for days, worried about their upcoming presentation to a new venture capital firm. He painted a picture of a loyal friend and partner terrified for her safety in a city that could turn on you in an instant. It was the first of many lies, the foundation of a narrative designed to frame him as a secondary victim, a young man whose ambition and friendship had been shattered by a senseless tragedy. The city's short fuse began to burn as the initial shock wore off, replaced by a simmering suspicion among those who knew the young pair. Ella was universally loved, a bright, ambitious woman who volunteered at a local animal shelter and always remembered her neighbors' birthdays. Patrick, on the other hand, was seen by some as too polished, his charm feeling less like genuine warmth and more like a high-pressure sales tactic. He drove a car that seemed too expensive, wore clothes that were out of place in their working-class circle, and spoke of a future that seemed detached from the reality of their struggling startup. Detective Mark Campbell, a veteran of the Philadelphia Homicide Division, felt the disconnect from the moment he interviewed Patrick. The teenager's story was too smooth, his emotions too perfectly calibrated for the cameras that had already begun to gather outside the crime scene. Campbell's instincts, honed by decades of navigating the city's tough streets and even tougher criminals, told him that Patrick McVeigh was not a grieving friend. He was a predator who had shed his skin, and the investigation would be a slow, painstaking process of proving that the boy wonder was in fact a monster. The preliminary financial investigation revealed the first crack in Patrick's facade. The startup's bank account, which should have held over $100,000 from their latest round of funding, was nearly empty. Small, untraceable withdrawals had been bleeding it dry for months. A pattern of financial vampirism that pointed to someone with inside access. When confronted with this, Patrick feigned shock, suggesting Ella must have had a secret problem, a gambling addiction or a hidden debt. He was planting seeds of doubt, callously tarnishing the name of the woman he had murdered to save himself. Ella's family, a tight-knit clan with deep roots in the city, refused to believe it for a second. They knew her work ethic, her frugality, her unwavering dedication to making their joint venture a success. They provided investigators with emails and text messages where Ella expressed growing concern over Patrick's spending habits and his evasiveness when she asked to see the company's financial records. She was on the verge of exposing him, planning to confront him the very week she was killed, a fact that turned Patrick's performance of grief into a sickening display of pure evil. The motive was becoming clear. It was a crime of absolute greed, a final brutal transaction to prevent the exposure of a long-term fraud. Patrick had not just killed his partner. He had been systematically robbing her for over a year, funding a life of luxury built on her trust and hard work. The murder was simply the cost of doing business, a final bloody measure to protect his intricate web of deception. In a city that prided itself on authenticity, Patrick McVeigh was a counterfeit human being, and the justice system was now tasked with exposing the rot beneath his polished veneer. The community's simmering anger was palpable. This wasn't a crime that could be explained away by desperation or a moment of rage. It was the result of a cold, parasitic relationship that had escalated to its only logical conclusion when the host threatened to remove the parasite. The media narrative quickly shifted from a tragic random act of violence to the chilling story of a teenage sociopath hiding in plain sight. Philadelphia was now watching, waiting for the system to confirm what they already suspected in their gut, that the boy who cried wolf over his partner's death was in fact the wolf himself. The stage was set for a legal battle that would dissect the nature of evil and the terrifying ease with which it can masquerade as friendship. The arrest of Patrick McVeigh took place just 6 days after Ella Martinez's body was discovered. A swift and decisive action driven by the mounting financial evidence and the inconsistencies in his story. Detectives arrived at his parents' suburban home, a place of manicured lawns and quiet conformity that stood in stark contrast to the gritty reality of his crime. There were no tears, no shock, no denial when the cuffs were placed on his wrists. Instead, Patrick seemed almost relieved, as if the curtain had finally risen on the performance he was born to give. He carried himself not like a scared teenager, but like a star taking the stage for his most important role. In the sterile confines of the interrogation room at the Philadelphia Police Department headquarters, the real Patrick McVeigh began to emerge. Seated across from Detective Campbell, he was the picture of unearned confidence, a pathological liar, so convinced of his own fabrications that he saw the truth as a minor inconvenience. He constructed a complex and detailed alibi, claiming he was at a solo movie screening across town, even providing the title of the film and a critique of the cinematography. It was a lie built on a foundation of pure contempt for the intelligence of the officers he was speaking to. He described his last conversation with Ella, inventing a story about her being distraught over a secret older boyfriend who was pressuring her for money. He painted a vivid picture of a woman unraveling a narrative designed to shift the blame onto a phantom figure while positioning himself as her concerned confidant. Each lie was delivered with unwavering eye contact and a steady voice, a performance of deception so practiced it was clear this was not his first time manipulating the world around him. Detective Campbell, a man who had seen every type of liar the city could produce, recognized the pattern immediately. This was not just dishonesty. It was a fundamental disconnection from reality. When Campbell presented Patrick with cell phone tower data that placed him within a block of Ella's house at the time of the murder, the teenager's composure didn't crack. It hardened. He simply shifted his story, claiming he had gone to check on her, but left when she didn't answer the door, deciding not to mention it earlier to avoid causing her family unnecessary worry. The ease with which he abandoned one elaborate lie for another was breathtaking, a display of mental gymnastics rooted in a profound narcissistic belief that he could talk his way out of anything. He showed no shame in being caught, only a flicker of annoyance that his audience wasn't appreciating the artistry of his fiction. The interrogation stretched for 4 hours, a masterclass in sociopathic deflection. Patrick answered questions with condescending questions of his own. He corrected Campbell's grammar, and he feigned concern for the detective's long hours, suggesting he should get some rest. It was a psychological power play, an attempt to reverse the roles and establish himself as the one in control of the room. He seemed to relish the attention, the focus, the feeling of being the center of a high-stakes drama he had authored himself. This was not a suspect being questioned. It was a king holding court. The true nature of his personality was revealed when Campbell, growing tired of the games, presented a single damning piece of evidence, a security camera photo from a neighbor's house showing Patrick's car parked on Ellis Street. The timestamp on the image directly contradicted his new alibi. For the first time, Patrick's smug demeanor faltered, but it wasn't replaced by fear or remorse. It was replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated rage, a brief glimpse of the monster beneath the mask. Angry not that he had been caught, but that his intellectual superiority had been successfully challenged. He quickly recovered, launching into a new fabrication. He claimed he had lent his car to a friend that night, a friend he conveniently couldn't name because it would get them into trouble with their parents. The lies became more desperate, more transparently false, yet he delivered them with the same arrogant conviction. He was like a gambler doubling down on a losing hand, utterly incapable of admitting defeat. His contempt for the investigators was so profound that he believed even the most absurd lie was more plausible than the simple damning truth. The interrogation ended not with a confession, but with a stalemate. Patrick McVeigh had not admitted to anything, but his web of lies was so tangled and self-contradictory that it served as a confession in itself. He had lied about his whereabouts, lied about his relationship with the victim, and lied about the company's finances. He had shown a chilling lack of empathy, a complete inability to process the gravity of the situation, and an unnerving enjoyment of the intellectual combat of the interrogation. This wasn't just a denial of guilt. It was a declaration of war on the very concept of objective reality. As he was led from the interrogation room to a holding cell, Patrick caught a glimpse of Ella's parents standing down the hall, their faces etched with a grief so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. He didn't look away in shame or sorrow. He met their gaze, and for a fleeting moment, a small, almost imperceptible smirk played on his lips. It was a look of triumph, the expression of a con artist who had just closed a deal, a final silent taunt that confirmed everything Detective Campbell already knew. The Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, led by the sharp and formidable Audrey Ross, knew they had a difficult case ahead. Without a confession or a murder weapon, they would have to build their case on a mountain of circumstantial evidence, meticulously deconstructing Patrick's lies for the jury. But they also knew they had a powerful weapon on their side, Patrick McVeigh himself. His arrogance, his contempt, and his pathological need to control the narrative would, they hoped, be his own undoing in a courtroom where the truth has a way of asserting itself, even against the most skilled and dedicated of liars. With Patrick McVeigh in custody, prosecutor Audrey Ross and her team began the arduous task of excavating the truth from the mountain of lies he had constructed. They started with the finances, following the digital breadcrumbs that Patrick believed he had cleverly concealed. What they uncovered was not just a simple case of embezzlement. It was a portrait of a financial parasite who had systematically latched onto a trusting host and drained her of every resource, both professional and personal, long before he decided to end her life. The investigation revealed that Patrick's deception began almost from the moment he and Ella agreed to become partners. He had manipulated her into giving him sole control of the company's main bank account, citing a fabricated story about his expertise in financial management from a fictitious internship. From that point on, he treated the company's funds as his own personal slush fund, siphoning off thousands of dollars every month to finance a lifestyle completely disconnected from his reality. He was a teenager from a middle-class family playing the part of a tech mogul, and Ella's dreams were funding his delusion. He spent the money on designer clothes, extravagant meals at Philadelphia's most exclusive restaurants, and weekend trips to New York City, all of which he documented on a private social media account he hid from Ella. To her, he maintained the image of a frugal, hard-working partner, often complaining about being broke to elicit her sympathy. He would even borrow small amounts of cash from her for lunch, a cruel piece of theater performed by a boy who had just spent $500 of her money on a pair of sneakers. The psychological cruelty of his actions was as profound as the financial theft. The team discovered that Patrick had also taken out multiple credit cards in Ella's name, forging her signature on the applications. He used these cards for larger purchases, a high-end gaming computer, front-row concert tickets, and even a down payment on a luxury sports car he told his friends his parents had bought him for his birthday. He was not just stealing from his friend. He was methodically destroying her financial future, burying her in a mountain of debt that she never even knew existed. Each fraudulent charge was an act of profound disrespect, a testament to his belief that other people were merely instruments for his own gratification. This parasitic relationship extended beyond their business. Investigators learned that Patrick had been living rent-free in a small apartment his parents owned. Yet, he told Ella he was struggling to pay for a high-rise unit downtown. On at least 3 occasions, she had given him large sums of her own money to help him avoid eviction, an act of kindness he accepted without a flicker of shame. He was a black hole of entitlement, and her generosity was simply fuel for his narcissistic fire. The prosecution now had a clear and damning motive. Ella was getting close to discovering the full extent of his financial betrayal, and a simple murder was easier than facing the consequences. The twist in the case came not from the bank statements, but from Patrick's personal laptop. Forensic analysts uncovered a hidden encrypted folder containing what could only be described as a business plan for a new life. It was a meticulously detailed document outlining his intention to drain the last of the startup's funds, fake his own death, and move to Europe under a new identity. He had been researching how to obtain false passports, open offshore bank accounts, and create a new identity that would be untraceable by American authorities. The plan was chilling in its detail and its complete lack of emotion. He referred to Ella not by her name, but as the asset, and her murder was listed as Phase 1 asset liquidation. The document read like a corporate strategy memo, a cold and clinical outline for a hostile takeover of a human life. He had planned to kill her, drain the accounts, and disappear, leaving her family to believe she had been the victim of a random robbery, while he began a new life of luxury funded by her murder. This discovery transformed the case from a crime of greed to a crime of profound premeditated evil. The file also contained a list of potential future targets. He had been researching other young entrepreneurs in the Philadelphia tech scene, evaluating them based on their wealth, their level of trust, and their perceived vulnerability. Ella Martinez was not his final victim. She was his first. He was a budding serial con artist, and his ambitions were escalating from financial fraud to murder as a tool of business. The investigation had uncovered not just a killer, but a monster in development. This evidence provided Audrey Ross with the narrative she needed for trial. She could now paint a picture of a defendant who was not a teenager who made one horrible mistake, but a cold, calculating predator who had been grooming his victim for over a year. He was a financial parasite whose ultimate goal was to consume his host entirely. The defense would undoubtedly try to portray him as a troubled kid who panicked. But this document was a direct refutation of that, a manifesto of his malevolent intentions written in his own words. The atmosphere in the city, already tense, grew darker with these revelations. The story of the secret ledger in the escape plan leaked to the press, and the public's perception of Patrick McVeigh solidified. He was a modern-day monster, a child of privilege, who saw other human beings as nothing more than obstacles or opportunities. The blue-collar soul of Philadelphia, a city that respects hard work and honesty above all else, was collectively revolted. The stage was now set for a trial that would feel less like a search for guilt and more like a formal exorcism of an evil that had taken root in their community. In the months leading up to the trial, Patrick McVeigh was held at the Philadelphia Industrial Correctional Center, a place far removed from the world of luxury and influence he had tried to build for himself. Confined to a small cell, stripped of his designer clothes and his audience, his arrogance began to curdle into a more volatile form of defiance. He saw the legal process not as a reckoning for his actions, but as an elaborate and deeply unfair conspiracy designed to persecute him for his superior intellect and ambition. His interactions with his court-appointed defense attorney Charles Fisher were a case study in narcissistic contempt. Fisher, a seasoned public defender who believed everyone deserved a vigorous defense, found himself in an impossible position. Patrick refused to cooperate, treating their strategy sessions as a pointless formality. He would doodle on legal pads, correct Fisher's pronunciation, and openly laugh at the suggestion that he should show some semblance of remorse to the court. He was not interested in a defense. He was interested in continuing his one-man show. The central conflict of this pre-trial phase emerged from a letter. Patrick had written a detailed bragging account of the murder to a friend, a 6-page missive filled with self-aggrandizing prose and cruel jokes at Ella's expense. He had tried to have it smuggled out of the jail, but it was intercepted by a guard during a routine cell inspection. This letter was a prosecutor's dream, a written confession laced with the kind of unrepentant evil that would horrify any jury. When Audrey Ross filed a motion to have the letter admitted as evidence, Patrick's arrogance reached a new peak. During a pre-trial hearing while being held in a small room adjacent to the courtroom, he saw his opportunity. Believing he was unobserved, he asked the bailiff for a glass of water. When the bailiff's back was turned, Patrick grabbed the evidence bag containing the letter, tore it open, and attempted to shove the crumpled pages into his mouth and swallow them. It was a desperate, primal act of a cornered animal, an attempt to literally consume his own words to prevent them from being used against him. The bailiff subdued him within seconds, pulling the soggy, half-chewed remnants of the letter from his mouth. The incident was a stunning display of pure foolish arrogance. He had not only failed to destroy the evidence, but had in the process created an even more damning story for the prosecution. His attempt to eat his own confession was a physical manifestation of his guilt, a theatrical and undeniable admission of the letter's damning contents. The act demonstrated a consciousness of guilt, so profound it was almost comical in its desperation. News of the incident spread like wildfire. The image of the sophisticated teen killer trying to eat a letter in a courthouse holding cell shattered any remaining illusion of his being a master manipulator. He was exposed as a petulant child throwing a tantrum, a common criminal whose schemes had finally run out of road. In the tough, no-nonsense culture of Philadelphia, this act was seen not as a clever gambit, but as a cowardly and pathetic display that only solidified his guilt in the court of public opinion. For his defense attorney, it was the final straw. Charles Fisher was a professional, but even he had his limits. The public and chaotic attempt to destroy evidence committed in the very heart of the justice system was an act of such profound disrespect for the law that it made a mockery of his role as an advocate. It demonstrated that his client was not just uncooperative, but actively hostile to his own defense, more interested in acts of chaotic defiance than in the logical process of a trial. Patrick's family, who had until this point maintained a quiet but firm belief in his innocence, began to distance themselves. His actions were becoming indefensible, his behavior more monstrous than they could have imagined. The boy they had raised, the charming and ambitious son they knew, was being replaced by a caricature of a villain from a cheap crime novel. The destruction of the letter was an act so transparently guilty that even the most biased parental love struggled to rationalize it. Audrey Ross, meanwhile, knew she had been handed a gift. She could now walk into the trial and tell the jury not only about the financial parasitism and the cold-blooded murder, but also about the defendant's own desperate physical attempt to conceal his guilt. He had tried to swallow his own evil words, and the system had made him choke on them. The mask of remorse, which he had never bothered to wear, was now irrelevant. His true face had been revealed not by a clever prosecutor or a surprise witness, but by his own insatiable and self-destructive arrogance. The trial was about to begin, and the defendant had already started to cannibalize his own case. The trial of Patrick McVeigh began on a cold morning in October, the stone halls of the Philadelphia City Hall courtroom buzzing with a nervous energy. The case had captured the city's attention, a grim fable of ambition and betrayal that felt both shocking and strangely familiar in a world increasingly defined by curated online personas. As Patrick was led into the courtroom, dressed in an ill-fitting suit, he surveyed the gallery with the air of a celebrity walking a red carpet, a small, arrogant smile playing on his lips as he took his seat next to his beleaguered attorney. The prosecution, led by Audrey Ross, began its opening statement with a moment of poignant silence. She placed a large, vibrant photograph of Ella Martinez on an easel facing the jury, a picture of her smiling on a sunny day, full of life and promise. This image of the victim, alive and happy, hung in the air, a stark and heartbreaking contrast to the cold reality of the crime. Ross wanted the jury to see not just a name on a legal document, but the human being whose future had been stolen for the price of a sports car and a European fantasy. Then Ross delivered her bombshell. She walked the jury through the evidence of financial fraud, the web of lies, and the calculated cruelty of Patrick's long-term deceptio. But the shocking fact that she had saved for her opening statement was not about the money. Forensic analysis of Patrick's computer had revealed something far more sinister than his escape plan. A meticulously designed soundproofed room he was secretly building in the basement of a warehouse he had leased under a shell corporation. The room was equipped with restraints, a drain in the floor, and a one-way mirror, a custom-built chamber of horrors. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Patrick's plan was never to just kill Ella and run. That was merely the first step. The warehouse, funded by the money he stole from her, was intended to be his personal murder castle, a place where his deceptions could escalate to their most monstrous conclusions. The list of other potential victims found on his laptop now had a terrifying new context. He was not just a con artist who had escalated to murder. He was an aspiring serial killer who had been methodically building his own private abattoir. The revelation turned the entire case on its head. This was no longer about a business partnership gone wrong. It was about stopping a predator before he could fully realize his horrifying ambitions. The jury, a cross-section of Philadelphia's diverse and tough-minded citizenry, stared at Patrick McVeigh with a new understanding. The smirking, confident teenager at the defense table was not just a murderer. He was a monster in his larval stage, and they were looking at the blueprints for the unspeakable evil he had planned for his future. Patrick's reaction to this revelation was perhaps the most damning evidence of all. As Ross described the details of the hidden room, he did not look shocked, scared, or ashamed. He looked proud. He leaned over to his attorney, Charles Pfizer, and whispered something, a small, smug smile on his face, as if Ross were a professor praising his brilliant but misunderstood project. He was pleased that his genius had been recognized, even in this context, a display of malignant narcissism that was utterly chilling to behold. The victim's family wept openly, the horror of what had happened to their daughter now compounded by the horror of what could have come next. Her father, a stoic man who had worked in the city shipyards for 40 years, buried his face in his hands, his body shaking with a grief that was now mixed with a terrifying new dimension of rage. Ella had not just been murdered. She had been the seed money for a future campaign of torture and death. The defense's opening statement, by contrast, was a pathetic and feeble attempt to put out a forest fire with a water pistol. Charles Pfizer, visibly shaken by his own client's reaction, tried to argue that the plans for the room were nothing more than a childish fantasy, the dark writings of an imaginative but harmless teenager. But the argument rang hollow. The jury had seen the detailed architectural plans, the receipts for building materials, the search history for soundproofing foam and industrial locks. This was not a fantasy. It was a work in progress. The first day of the trial concluded with the indelible image of Patrick McVeigh, the aspiring monster, looking not at the judge or the jury, but at the gallery, at the reporters, at the public. He was scanning the crowd, his eyes searching for the recognition he so clearly craved. He had authored a horror story, and he was now basking in the terror it had created. The city of Philadelphia, with its unflinching gaze, stared back, no longer seeing a boy but a void, an emptiness that had sought to fill itself with the lives and dreams of others. The question of his guilt already felt settled. The only question that remained was how many lives had been saved by his capture. As the trial entered its second week, Audrey Ross began to systematically construct a cage of evidence around Patrick McVeigh, each piece a steel bar, locking him further into his own lies. The prosecution presented a dry but damning parade of financial experts, bank managers, and credit card fraud investigators who meticulously detailed the scope of Patrick's financial parasitism. The jury saw forged signatures, falsified invoices, and a complex web of shell accounts designed to hide the slow, steady bleeding of Ella's company. Through it all, Patrick watched with a detached air of boredom, as if he were observing a particularly tedious lecture on a subject he had already mastered. The emotional core of the prosecution's case began with the testimony of Ella's friends and family, who painted a heartbreaking picture of her final months. They described her growing anxiety, her confusion over the missing funds, and her fear of confronting the friend she had trusted so implicitly. They spoke of a vibrant, brilliant young woman slowly being gaslighted into believing she was incompetent, a cruel psychological game Patrick played to keep her off balance while he continued his theft. Her own words came to life as Ross read aloud. Emails in which Ella apologized to Patrick for questioning his integrity, a testament to his insidious, manipulative power. The digital evidence was overwhelming. The jury was shown Patrick's secret social media profiles, a curated gallery of his stolen lifestyle. They saw photos of him on yachts, at Champagne-fueled parties, and in five-star hotels, all posted on the same days he was texting Ella about their company's dire financial straits. The stark contrast between the public image he sold to his victim and the private reality he funded with her money was a portrait of breathtaking hypocrisy and malice. The prosecution then presented his search history, a journey into the darkest corners of a depraved mind. The jury saw the queries in stark black and white on the courtroom monitors. How to get away with murder, easiest way to break a neck, how to dissolve a body with household chemicals, best soundproofing for screams. The searches were time-stamped, showing a methodical and escalating interest in murder in the weeks leading up to Ella's death. Charles Fisher could only argue that his client was a fan of crime fiction, an explanation so flimsy it was an insult to the jury's intelligence. Then came the mid-trial twist, the moment that elevated the case from a single horrific murder to something far more extensive. Audrey Ross called a surprise witness to the stand, a forensic geologist from the Pennsylvania State Police. He testified about analyzing soil samples taken from a shovel found in the trunk of Patrick's car. The soil contained a unique combination of minerals and trace elements that did not match the area around Ella's home or any other property associated with Patrick. It was a dead end, until on a hunch the lab ran the sample against a database of soil from unsolved crime scenes across the state. They found a match. The soil from Patrick's shovel was a perfect match to the soil found at the burial site of another body, a young man named David Olson, a former business associate of Patrick's who had vanished without a trace 2 years earlier from a neighboring county. And Olson's case had gone cold, a missing person report that had eventually been filed away as a probable runaway. But now, this newly discovered forensic evidence provided a direct physical link between Patrick McVeigh and a second similar crime. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Patrick McVeigh was not just a murderer, he was a serial killer. The pattern was sickeningly clear. He would enter into a business partnership with a trusting, ambitious person, exploit them financially, and then eliminate them when they became a liability. David Olson was his first victim, his trial run. The confidence and lack of panic he displayed after killing Ella were not the signs of a first-time killer, but the practiced calm of someone who had done this before. Patrick's reaction was a flicker of pure fury. His carefully constructed narrative of being a unique, brilliant mastermind was shattered. He was just another grubby, repetitive monster, a predator with a single, unimaginative trick. The revelation of a past crime demystified him, reducing his grand, evil design to a sordid and predictable pattern of violence. He glared at the forensic expert on the stand with a look of such intense hatred. It was as if the man had personally insulted his artistic vision. This new evidence was the key that unlocked everything. It explained Patrick's unnerving composure, his practiced lies, and the meticulous planning that went into the crime. He had learned from his mistakes with David Olson, refining his methods to become a more efficient killer. For Audrey Ross, this was the moment the case was won. She could now show the jury that Ella's murder was not an isolated incident, but the latest chapter in a horrifying story of predatory greed. The city of Philadelphia, already captivated by the trial, was now looking at one of the most shocking cases in its modern history. A teenage boy from the suburbs was not just a con artist and a murderer, but a serial killer who had been hiding in plain sight, using his youth and charm as the perfect camouflage. The trial was no longer just about getting justice for Ella Martinez. It was about ensuring that Patrick McVeigh would never have the chance to add another name to his list of liquidated assets. The revelation that Patrick McVeigh was likely a serial killer sent a shock wave through the courtroom, leaving his defense attorney, Charles Fisher, with a case that was not just unwinnable, but fundamentally indefensible. The forensic link to the David Olson case had obliterated any possibility of creating reasonable doubt. Fisher's strategy, which had been to portray Patrick as a troubled but not monstrous teenager, was now in ashes. Faced with this impossible situation, the defense made a desperate, reckless move that would backfire in spectacular fashion. Their new strategy was to pivot from arguing innocence to arguing ineptitude on the part of the police. They would attempt to discredit the investigation by claiming evidence was mishandled and that their client was the victim of a biased rush to judgment. To do this, they decided to introduce a piece of evidence they claimed the police had overlooked, a printed email supposedly written by Ella Martinez to a therapist in which she discussed feelings of depression and suicidal ideation. The defense's narrative was that Ella had taken her own life and that the police, blinded by their suspicion of Patrick, had ignored the obvious signs. It was a disgusting and desperate gambit, a final callous attempt to slander the victim to save the killer. The moment Charles Fisher presented the email to the court, Audrey Ross objected, her voice sharp with controlled fury. The judge allowed the email to be marked for identification, but granted the prosecution a 24-hour recess to examine the document before it could be presented to the jury. It was a brief pause that would prove fatal to the defense's entire case. Audrey Ross's team of digital forensic experts worked through the night. They knew the email was a fake, but they had to prove it conclusively. The document the defense had provided was a physical printout, but Ross' team was able to issue an emergency warrant to the email provider. What they received back from the tech company was the digital equivalent of a smoking gun. The email had not been sent from Ella's account. It had been sent from a newly created ghost account routed through a series of international servers to mask its origin. But the forger had made a rookie mistake. Embedded in the email's metadata was a tiny, invisible digital watermark that identified the specific model of computer and the unique software license used to create it. The license was registered to a public library in a small town just outside Philadelphia. Working with the library, investigators pulled security footage from the time the email was sent. And there, sitting at a computer terminal, was Patrick McVeigh's father, a man who had sat in the courtroom every day with a look of mournful disbelief on his face. The next day in court was pure pandemonium. As Charles Fisher prepared to call a handwriting expert to authenticate Ella's signature on the forged email, Audrey Ross approached the bench. In a tense, whispered conference with the judge, she presented the evidence of the forgery, including a still image from the library security camera showing Patrick's father at the computer. The judge's face turned crimson with rage. This was not just a desperate legal tactic. It was a criminal conspiracy to commit perjury and obstruct justice unfolding in his own courtroom. The judge excused the jury and then unleashed a torrent of judicial fury upon the defense team. He accused them of at best gross negligence and at worst active participation in a fraud on the court. Charles Pfizer was aghast. He had been given the document by Patrick's family and had taken their word that it was authentic. He had been used not just by his client, but by his client's entire family in a clumsy and illegal attempt to fabricate an alternate reality. The plot had been orchestrated by Patrick from jail. He had coached his father on what to write and how to send the email, convinced that this one forged document could undo the mountain of forensic evidence against him. It was an act of staggering arrogance, a belief that he could manipulate the very fabric of the justice system with one more lie. But like all his other schemes, it was too clever by half. A complex plan that collapsed under the weight of its own hubris. The forged email was not only thrown out, but the judge informed the jury that the defense had attempted to introduce fabricated evidence, a statement that was a death blow to their credibility. Patrick's father was arrested for perjury and conspiracy to obstruct justice right outside the courtroom. The defense's narrative had not just crumbled, it had spectacularly imploded, transforming a murder trial into a showcase of the MCY family's collective criminality and contempt for the law. Patrick watched all of this unfold with a look of profound disappointment, not in himself for getting caught, but in his father for failing to execute the plan correctly. There was no remorse, no fear, only the frustration of a director whose actor had botched a critical scene. He had gambled everything on one last great deception, and it had failed, exposing him and his family as not just malicious, but incompetent. The trial would continue, but the verdict was no longer in any doubt. With the defense's case in ruins and Patrick McVeigh's guilt all but certified, the trial moved into its final, most heart-wrenching phase, the victim impact statements. This was the moment for the court to hear not about evidence and legal statutes, but about the human cost of Patrick's greed, the void left behind by the extinguishum. And of a beautiful life. It was a chance for Ella Martinez to be remembered as more than just a name on a case file, and the emotional weight in the courtroom was suffocating. Ella's mother, Maria Martinez, was the first to speak. A small, dignified woman clutching a crumpled tissue. She walked slowly to the podium, her steps heavy with a grief that seemed to defy the laws of physics. She did not speak of anger or hatred. Instead, she spoke of the small, quiet moments that had been stolen from her. The Sunday morning phone calls, the shared laughter over a silly movie, the comforting smell of her daughter's favorite perfume. She described a young woman of boundless kindness and fierce loyalty, a daughter who was the bright, warm center of their family's universe. She spoke of Ella's dreams, not just for her company, but for her life. She had wanted to travel, to get married, to have children of her own. As Maria spoke, her voice thick with unshed tears, she created a portrait of a future that had been brutally erased, a timeline of joy and love that now existed only as a painful ghost. The entire courtroom, from the jury to the seasoned court reporters, was wrapped in a profound and respectful silence, bearing witness to a mother's bottomless sorrow. It was during this moment, at the absolute peak of the statement's emotional power, that Patrick McVeigh made his move. As Maria Martinez's voice cracked while describing the last time she hugged her daughter, Patrick let out a loud theatrical yawn. He stretched his arms over his head, rolled his eyes in a gesture of profound boredom, and then turned his head to stare pointedly at the clock on the courtroom wall, tapping his fingers on the defense table as if waiting for a bus. The act was so shocking, so brazenly cruel, that for a moment nobody reacted. It was a gesture of contempt, so complete and absolute that it seemed to break the basic rules of human decency. He was not just ignoring the pain he had caused. He was actively mocking it, treating a mother's cry of anguish as a tedious interruption in his day. The yawn of contempt was a final ugly confession, a clear statement that he felt nothing, no remorse, no guilt, no empathy, only a petulant annoyance that he was being forced to listen to the consequences of his actions. A low growl of outrage rumbled through the gallery. Ella's father, who had been sitting silently with his head bowed, shot to his feet, his face a mask of pure murderous rage. He took a step toward the defense table before being gently but firmly restrained by a bailiff. The judge banged his gavel, his own face pale with disbelief and disgust. He called for a brief recess, his voice trembling with a barely controlled fury at the scene that had just unfolded. For the jury, this was the breaking point. They had seen the financial records, the forensic reports, and the blueprint for a torture chamber. But it was this one small silent gesture, this yawn that seemed to encapsulate the entirety of Patrick McVeigh's evil. It was the physical manifestation of a soul that was utterly empty, a black hole of narcissism that could not even perform the basic human ritual of finding sympathy for a grieving mother. It was more damning than any piece of evidence the prosecution could have presented. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. The last vestiges of legal formality seemed to have been burned away, leaving only the raw, ugly truth of the crime. Patrick's lawyer, Charles Fisher, sat slumped in his chair, his face ashen. He did not look at his client. There was nothing left to defend, nothing left to argue. His client had just demonstrated in a way more powerful than any testimony that he was not just a killer, but a monster, utterly devoid of a soul. The remaining impact statements were delivered, each one a fresh wave of grief washing over the courtroom, but everyone's eyes kept returning to Patrick McVeigh, who now sat with a faint, self-satisfied smirk on his face. He had gotten the attention he craved. He had made himself the center of the story once again, not through cleverness or charm, but through an act of such profound and memorable cruelty that no one in that room would ever forget it. He had lost the trial, but in his twisted mind he had won the moment. The defense, now operating in a state of pure desperation, had one final move to make. In a last-ditch effort to generate a shred of sympathy for their client, they decided to call a character witness, Patrick's older sister, K.H. Lowe McVeigh. The strategy was transparently foolish. They hoped she would speak of a troubled but loving brother, perhaps planting a seed of doubt, or at least humanizing the monster who had just yawned at a grieving mother. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. K.H. Lowe McVeigh was a quiet, nervous young woman who seemed to carry the weight of her family's shame on her small shoulders. As she took the stand, she avoided looking at her broth. Her eyes fixed on a point on the far wall. Charles Fisher began with gentle questions, asking her to describe her brother's childhood, their family life, his ambitions. K.H. Lowe answered in a soft, halting voice, painting a generic picture of a normal suburban upbringing. But as the questioning continued, a visible tension grew within her. She kept glancing at the jury, then at the heartbroken faces of the Martinez family in the front row. The weight of her testimony and the lies it was built upon seemed to be physically crushing her. She knew the truth, and the sterile, formal environment of the courtroom was making it impossible to continue the charade that had defined her family for the past year. The turning point came when Audrey Ross began her cross-examination. Ross was not aggressive. Her tone was gentle, almost sympathetic. She didn't ask about Patrick's character. Instead, she asked Chloe about the forensic evidence linking her brother to the disappearance of David Olson, the second victim. She asked K.H. Lowe if she knew that her brother had been building a soundproof room in a warehouse. She asked her if she had seen the search history, the queries about how to dissolve a human body. With each question, Chloe seemed to shrink further into herself. These were not abstract legal arguments. They were concrete, horrifying facts about the person she shared a bloodline with. The foundation of denial she had been standing on began to crumble. The image of her brilliant, misunderstood little brother was being replaced by the undeniable reality of a serial predator. The conflict raging within her, loyalty to her family versus the fundamental demands of human decency, reached its breaking point. Audrey Ross paused, letting the silence in the courtroom hang heavy in the air. Then she asked the final simple question. "Chloe," she said, her voice soft but clear, "where was your brother on the night Ella Martinez was killed?" And then it happened. Khlo McVeigh broke. A strangled sob escaped her lips and she began to weep uncontrollably, her body shaking with the force of a confession that had been held back for too long. Through her tears, she looked not at Ross but directly at the Martinez family, her face a mask of profound shame and regret. "He was at home," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He came into my room late that night. He was happy." The courtroom held its breath. This was it. The final darkest lie about to be exposed by the one person Patrick thought would protect it forever. "What did he tell you, Chloe?" Ross pressed gently. Chloe took a deep, shuddering breath. "He told me he had finally solved his cash flow problem," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush of cathartic horror. "He said Ella wouldn't be a problem for the company anymore. And then he laughed. He told me how easy it was, how she looked so surprised. He described it to me. He was so proud of himself. It was the final devastating revelation. The confession had not been made to police under duress, but to his own sister in a moment of gleeful, triumphant pride. He had not been scared or panicked. He had been exhilarated. He had treated the murder of his friend as a clever business move, a successful corporate merger with death. Khlo's testimony was the key that unlocked the last door to his soul, revealing nothing inside but a cold, empty void. Patrick McVeigh's reaction was not of a man betrayed, but of a king overthrown by a disloyal subject. He leaped to his feet, his face contorted in a mask of pure reptilian fury. He screamed at his sister, calling her a liar, a traitor, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom. It took 3 baifs to restrain him, to wrestle him back into his seat as he fought and spat. His mask of calm intellectual superiority finally shattered, revealing the feral, cornered animal beneath. The defense case was not just over, it was annihilated. His own sister, called to the stand to save him, had instead provided the final irrefutable proof of his monstrosity. She had exposed his darkest lie, not that he was innocent, but that he was even remotely human. The jury had heard the truth, not from a lawyer or an expert, but from a family member who could no longer bear the burden of covering for a monster. Justice for Ella Martinez and for David Olson was now finally inevitable. The jury's deliberation was a mere formality, a brief postscript to a story whose ending had already been written. They returned in just under 1 hour, a clear and decisive repudiation of Patrick McVeigh's entire existence. The foreperson did not look at the defendant as they pronounced the word guilty on all counts, from first-degree murder to the litany of fraud charges. A wave of quiet, exhausted relief washed over the gallery, the collective exhalation of a city that had been holding its breath. As the verdict was read, Patrick McVeigh remained unnervingly still, a statue of pure defiance. The arrogant smirk, the look of intellect. Yule's superiority had returned to his face. He had lost the game, but he seemed determined to control his final scene, to exit the stage on his own terms. He stared directly at the Martinez family, his eyes cold and empty, offering no apology, no flicker of remorse, only a final silent assertion of his unshattered ego. Weeks later, at the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was once again packed. This was not about determining guilt, but about the formal imposition of consequence, the moment the system would officially declare that Patrick McVeigh's life as he knew it was over. Ella's father delivered a final powerful statement, speaking not to the judge, but directly to his daughter's killer. He did not speak of forgiveness, but of the legacy of kindness and brilliance that Patrick had failed to extinguish, a legacy that would outlive him 1,000 times over. The judge, a man known for his stoic and measured demeanor, seemed to set aside his judicial restraint. He spoke directly to Patrick, his voice dripping with a contempt he made no effort to conceal. He called him a cancer on the human soul and a monument to the emptiness of evil. He recounted the evidence in stark, brutal terms: the financial predation, the meticulously planned murder, the aborted dream of a torture chamber, and the final unforgivable act of yawning at a mother's grief. When the judge asked if the defendant had anything to say before the sentence was imposed, a hush fell over the room. Patrick McVeigh rose slowly to his feet, his chains clinking in the silence. He turned not to the judge but to his sister K.H. Lowe, who sat weeping in the gallery, and to the Martinez family, who watched him with a mixture of pain and steely resolve. And then his mask of control finally spectacularly disintegrated. What came out of his mouth was not a plea for mercy or a final lie, but a torrent of pure, undiluted venom. "You think this is over?" he screamed, his voice raw with a rage that was both terrifying and pathetic. He laughed, a high, unhinged sound that chilled the blood. "I'll see you all in hell," he shrieked, his eyes wild with a madness that had been lurking just beneath the surface all along. It was his final defiant act. As the judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would die in a cage, Patrick began to spit toward the victim's family. He fought against the baifs who swarmed him, a thrashing, screaming whirlwind of hate. He shouted a final chilling threat, a promise of violence so graphic and specific that it caused several people in the gallery to cry out in fear. He was dragged from the courtroom, still screaming, still fighting, a monster finally being pulled back into the darkness from which it came. His exit was not quiet or dignified. It was a chaotic, ugly spectacle that perfectly mirrored the nature of his soul. He was not a misunderstood genius or a master manipulator. He was just a hollow boy filled with a bottomless, violent rage, a failed con artist whose final product was his own self-destruction. Outside on the steps of the courthouse, the Martinez family stood together, blinking in the pale afternoon light, looking not triumphant but profoundly weary. They had received justice, but it would not bring their daughter back. In the tough, historic city of Philadelphia, a city that knows how to endure, they had faced down a monster and won. But the victory was a scar, a permanent reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a charming smile and the profound cost of a single unforgivable lie.